Good morning. So welcome back to Methods in Complex Systems. Unfortunately, everyone else came in late because I came in late also, which means that what I was going to say, hoping everybody would be here when I walked in, was the reason why I was late was that I was decoding a secret communication that was sent to me by aliens. And at the end of this class, I was going to reveal who Cartman's father is. But I couldn't say that because nobody was here when I came here. What we're going to talk about today, before that, is look at the statistical properties of fractals, which is what we've been building up to. Because we've been discussing statistics in this class, and the whole aside on fractals wasn't an aside, but was to build up to this point where we could understand what the statistical properties are. And if you remember, where the sequence of things that we've been doing is, first of all, we've described Gaussian statistics, which are based on assuming the data has a normal distribution. Oh, that was a particularly good one. So, and then we generalize this, so on a scale where things become more general. To what I called non-parametric statistics, which did not assume that we had a distribution, that is a probability density function, which apparently has become all caps, that has a particular form. But which does have certain other properties, such as the fact that the moments exist. Now to dealing with fractals, which are really a class of Lévy or Lévy stable distributions, where the moments, like the means and the variances, don't exist and can't be used to characterize the data. So now, after the description of fractal properties, we're now up to understanding how we need to analyze them and what it means to analyze them. And the crucial aspect that we're going to use today in the discussion of fractals is, remember, when we look at a fractal, as we look at finer and finer pieces, we blow it up, we see things that still look self-similar. And what this means is we go from big scales to small scales, that some value we measured, for example, this length here, will get longer and longer. So there's no single value for a property, but it depends on the measurement scale. Okay. So now let's go to see what we're normally used to expecting in a situation is that as we calculate the mean, as we accumulate more and more data in our sample, the values of the means of those sample, which are called the sample means, will eventually maybe have some variation in them, but converge to a nice finite limiting value that we define as the population mean. And even the non-parametric statistics assume this. But what we see in the case of fractals is that as we accumulate more and more data, that the values of the mean will continually decrease, or the values of the mean will continually increase. And let me go back to here to make a point which although here I've drawn things as a geometric picture, what I also mean are probability density functions that have the same characteristics as objects like that. So, for example, if I had numbers, it would mean that if I do a measurement, that sometimes I have big numbers and sometimes I have little numbers, but I have an increasingly large number of very small numbers. So I mean also not only objects that have this characteristics, but sets of numbers that represent the characteristics of these objects. So when we have a system like this, then we have the situation where the mean keeps decreasing and the mean keeps increasing. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't calculate a mean from the data. If I have 5 values, for example, these first 5 measurements, that I can add them together, which is 56, 59, 62 divided by 5, which is something, 1, 2, etc. So I can actually calculate the mean of the samples of the sample, which in this case is these 5 numbers. But that's not what we're hoping when we do the mean. We're really hoping to get at the population mean. And in this case, I can always calculate the mean, but it doesn't have any meaning in terms of what the population is. And this is a very important point because we can always carry out this operation on data, but this operation is meaningful only if we have the situation where these means converge to a limiting value as we have here. And if we have the situation as shown here instead, then although we computed of our data, we're not going to check as we have more data that it will converge. And so we get a number, and we're in the worst possible case because we have a number and we think it means something and it doesn't. So that's kind of the worst possible case to be in. The reason why this happens is shown here. If I have a series of objects or pieces that are fractal, so I have a few big pieces, lots of middle-sized pieces, and a huge number of small pieces, then, or I could, as I said, have a set of numbers that have this characteristic. So you can think of a set of numbers where we're looking at the diameters of each of these circles. So I mean these not only as an object, but as a set of numbers that would represent the diameters of these things. And this says the same thing. The mean is equal to the frequency at which each number appears times the value of that number divided by the sum of the set of frequencies. This is just another way of calculating the mean. So just to make sure that that's obvious, there's a famous, there are a bunch of stories about John von Neumann, whose name I mentioned in a different talk last Monday, actually. And he was teaching a class on mathematics at MIT, and he said that some fact was obvious, and one of the students in the class raised his hand and says, "Is this really obvious?" And supposedly von Neumann left the classroom to think. He was always very weird and always sort of disappearing. And he left the classroom for about a half hour and went back to his office, and then came back to the classroom and said, "Yes, it's obvious."
And the people were still in the classroom waiting for him?
This is MIT. I can imagine that people who are generally spaced out would be waiting in the classroom. The other von Neumann story is he was lost one day because he was this very absent-minded professor, and he just showed up at this house because he couldn't find where he lived. It's not clear this is a true story, but it could be, so I can't. But it could be. So he showed up at this house, and there was like a little kid playing in front of the house, so he was sort of desperate, so he asked the little kid if he could help him find where he lived. And the little kid said, "Yes, Daddy, you live here."
Oh,
So,
no.
If I have a set of numbers like this that I'm trying to find the average of, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers. The other way I could do this is I have 2 5s and 3 2s and 1 1. So I could multiply 2 times 5 plus 3 times 2 plus 1 plus 1 and divide this by 2 plus 3 plus 1. So in doing the average, it's the same thing as taking the frequency of each number and multiplying it by the value of that number, which is what I have displayed over here. So this is just a simpler, not a simpler, but one way of calculating the mean. And let's say that the contributions to this mean are dominated by the many small values. So a lot of times, that is very frequently, f1 is very large, there's a lot of small x's. Well, what's going to happen is that this term is going to dominate this sum, because we only have a few of these things, and so the large number of small things will dominate this term. So if this term is dominant, and if f1 is very large, that it's greater than all the other frequencies, then the numerator will be roughly f1 times x. Well, this stuff will cancel. And the denominator will be roughly f1, because this stuff will be small compared to f1. Then if we divide through by f1, we'll see that the mean is actually equal to the value of this small one, which makes sense, because we have a huge number of small ones. It dominates what we're trying to compute, and so the mean will be very small. But as we accumulate more and more data, we'll catch smaller and smaller things, and so the mean will go to 0. So this is a case where the mean goes to 0. You should interrupt me if I say things that is not clear to anyone, because I'm going step by step. I was thinking of downhill, but maybe it's uphill. This is the other case where the mean is not dominated by a large number of small things, but by a few big things. So every once in a while, there's one really big number. So for example, the numbers that we're accumulating in the experiment might look like 1, 2, 2, 1.5, 187. So if we do this, there's obviously 187 will dominate the calculation of the mean. And in that case, that corresponds to this term. So now, if this number is the largest, as we accumulate bigger and bigger numbers, the numerator here is going to get larger and larger, and so the few big numbers will push the mean toward infinity. So that corresponds to these two cases, one where the average size of the things keeps decreasing if it's dominated by the small things, and two, or we'll get a case where the average number keeps increasing. In which case we're in will depend on the relative number of large to small things, or numbers, for example, if it's data from an experiment. And we actually described last time the parameter that describes this. What was that parameter called? There was a way to characterize the relative number of the large things compared to the small things. Since we spent almost the entire time last time discussing one parameter, no?
Dimension?
Right, the fractal dimension. So the fractal dimension characterizes the relative number of large to small things. So if the dimension is low, then there's still more small things, but not a lot. But if the dimension is much higher, then there's a huge number of small things compared to large things. Now, I think that's true. I'd have to think about it a little bit, but I think that's true. So this dimension then tells us which case we're going to, yeah, it is true. This dimension tells us which case we're going to be in. I can say it in a different way. We said last time, for example, that the length of the coastline of Britain depends on the radius at which we measure it times some constant to the r to the 1 minus d. So if we look at the average length of the coastline, will be the length, that is the first moment, will be the length times the probability density function of how often we get that length. So that will look something like this. r to the 2 minus d. So if we integrate this, we get something that's proportional to r to the 3 minus d. And if d is bigger, so this will be between the limits of 0 and infinity. If d is greater than 3, then as we go to the limit at infinity, this will be 0 and will blow up at the limit of 0. No, the limit of 0 will be 0, so this whole moment will go to 0, and if d is less than 3, then this will go to infinity. So this is what I was just saying, that is that depending on the dimension, is the opposite of what I said, but depending on the dimension, the mean will either go to 0 or go to infinity. And if you apparently won't remember, but last time, how this limit changes between 0 and infinity was, as the dimension changes, was the basis of the Hausdorff-Besicovitch dimension. This was the definition of the Hausdorff-Besicovitch dimension, that there's a critical dimension at which these limits change from 0 to infinity. It's defined in a slightly different way in terms of the sets and the gauge function, but it's basically related to this property. So this says it in a little more formal way. And let me, yeah.
You said just before that that you were characterizing low dimension versus high dimension.
Right.
So can you just go through that bit again? You said high dimension, there's a huge number of small things compared to large.
Okay. Let me see if I can derive this or say it in real time. The crucial point is that the number of things typically goes like r to the minus d. So let's look at the number of things at one scale, which we'll call big R, compared to the number of things at a smaller scale. And so that's going to be like capital R to the little r to the minus d. So the number of things at a bigger scale goes like the number of things at a little scale times the ratio of those scales, in this case to the plus d, because I've inverted this. Okay? So this means, let's say, if little r is less than r, as we raise it to some power d, which will be, let's say, greater than 1, that this will be a small number. So this means that number of things at big R equals number of things at little r times a small number. But the size, so again, it says that the number of big things is less than the number of small things. Now, the exact ratio here depends on this factor. So this factor, this d, determines the relative ratio of the number of big things to the number of small things. And as d is bigger, what I said was correct. As d is bigger, then this ratio will be more disparate. So the number of big things will be, the ratio of small things to big things will be bigger. So there are fewer big things compared to small things as d is bigger. This is right. I actually did this in a straightforward way, actually. Okay, so let me give now an example of some statistical distributions from mathematics and from real life examples that have this property. And one of them, and I'll do this by, at the beginning, comparing non-fractal things to fractal things. So let's play a game. But it's an interesting game because we're going to bet money on this game. So this is a pretty serious game. And let's say we toss a coin. And if we toss the coin, it can wind up tails or heads. I think we discussed in this class what the official names for tails and heads are. Did we do that? The official name for the back side of a coin is the reverse side, okay, instead of tails. And the official name for the other side of the coin is what? No, it's not the front side. It's actually called the obverse. So it's the obverse and the reverse. So if this was an undergraduate class, then I would say, and yes, that will be on the final, but I won't say that. So we toss a coin. If it turns up tails, we don't win anything. If it's heads, we win $1. So what are the average winnings of this thing? Well, in order to compute the average winnings, let's slide back here. What we did at the very beginning of the class, or we should have done if we didn't, the mean winnings is equal to the probability of a certain outcome times how much we would win summed over all outcomes. So the mean winnings here then is with a probability of a half, we come up tails and we win nothing. And with probability of a half, assuming it's a fair coin, we win $1 if it comes up heads. So doing this calculation, we find that the mean winnings is $0.50 or 50 cents. So this is just the usual way of calculating the mean. In fact, this is exactly what I had before because we have the probability and the probability of an outcome times the amount of the outcome, which is just what we were doing before in order to get the mean. So this is just what I had before, or is related to what I had before. What we had before in order to do this, remember, is we had the frequency, the sum of the frequency times the value divided by the sums of the frequency. But if I divide through by each of these, each one of these elements divided by the frequency is the probability. So this is just the same thing. And that is f of I divided by the whole sum of all of them is really just the probability of getting each one. Okay. So in this game, the probability is we'll win a half. So the idea here is we have to decide if we want to play the game, the house is going to charge us a certain amount to play the game, and then we'll win or lose. And we want to make it a fair game. So the house is just as likely to make money as we are. So if we play this game, we should be willing to bet 50 cents. So we'll put down 50 cents, and either we'll win nothing or win $1. And over the long run, we'll win on average 50 cents. So the house should charge us 50 cents to play the game. Is that clear? You sure? Okay. So let's go on to another game. This is a game no, I actually know which of the Bernoullis is involved in this game.
Actually, you're not winning anything.
Right, we're not winning anything. That's right, that's right. On average, we're going to break even, and the house is going to break even. So that's the definition of a fair game.
Yeah?
Well, it's fair both to us and to the house. We're saying that well, it's fair to you too. You don't have an advantage, but you don't have a disadvantage, right? Okay, I mean, but if the house charged you $1 each time to play, then on average you'd be losing 50 cents a game. So you wouldn't want to play that game. Okay, so you could argue that you don't want to play a game that's unfair, but the house doesn't want to play a game that's unfair. Okay? If you only want to play unfair games, that's very biased. So we have this other game, which is here. In this game, which was invented by one of the Bernoullis who lived in St. Petersburg, and then published by his brother who lived in Germany. And in this game, we toss a coin until it comes up heads. Okay, so this is different. We may have to toss the coin many, many times until it comes up heads. If it comes up heads on the first shot, we win $2. If we don't get heads on the first shot, if it's a tail and then a head, we win $4. If we have to do 2 tails and then a head, we win $8. 3 tails and then a head is $16. So let's now compute the probability, what the average winnings are. In each case, the probability of getting this is a half. The probability of getting this outcome and then the next outcome is a half times a half. The probability of getting this and that, because we multiply the probabilities together, is a half times a half, which is an eighth. And again, this is 1/16. So with probability, the first one is 1 over 2, 2 to the minus 1, and we win $2. Second one is 1 over 2 to the, 2 to the minus 2 times 2 squared, 1/4 times 4 we would win. The next one, the probability of getting it is an eighth, and we win 8, etc. But this goes all the way up forever. For those of you who walked in late, of course, at the beginning of the class, I announced who Kaufman's father was. So we have 1 plus 1 plus 1, which goes on forever. So the average winnings in this game are infinite. Now here, there's no way to make this a fair game. Because what happens here is that we have an argument between us and the bank about how much money should be bet. That is, we say that half the time we're only going to win on the first shot. We're only going to win $2. So therefore, we say what we should be willing to do is to put up $2 to play this game, because half the time we'll win $2. Okay? On the other hand, what the bank says is that the average winnings, the mean winnings for this is infinite. So we should put up more than all the money in the world to play this game. Okay, so this is called a paradox. And it's called the St. Petersburg paradox. So let's investigate a little more detail. And this is very much like this fractal business, because now we have a mean value which is going to infinity. So this is very much like what I've just been describing, and we're going to see the other fractal properties of this in just a moment. One of the fractal properties of this is that as we accumulate more data, and this is an example where I ran 10 million trials on my Macintosh computer, so I didn't have it flip a coin, but I had to pick a random number between 0 and 1, and if the number was less than a half, it was heads, and greater than a half, it was tails, or vice versa, whatever I did. I've played both of these games 10 million times. And here I've computed the mean winnings after playing the game n times. So you can see at the beginning here I was lucky a little bit with the ordinary coin toss. I was winning a little bit. But after a while, I was back down to winning only half the time. These boxes should be exactly on this 0.5 line. In fact, it worked out to 0.5 to as many decimal places as I had in the calculation, because I remember that vividly. So on average, I win 50% of the time. But look what happens, or on average I win 50 cents, averaged over many games. But this is what happened when I played the St. Petersburg game. You can see that the longer I played this game, the more the average winnings increased. Because every once in a while I toss a lot of tails before I get ahead. And when I do that, then I win a big amount of money. Okay, and when I win that big amount of money, it biases the mean. So this is an example where the fractal dimension is large enough or has the right value so that there are a few big numbers that bias the mean. And you can see that this is very different than how we would normally handle measurements, because we would think as you accumulate more data, the mean would get more accurate, as it does in this case. But it doesn't get more accurate, it keeps changing. And this is a good example of a fractal set of numbers. And this is going to be a second example. So again, I'll compare a fractal to a non-fractal set of numbers. This, although it doesn't come through well on the screen, is a checkerboard with equally sized white and black boxes. And what I've done here is to compute the average density, which means I've taken a circle. You can't see it, but I see a red circle here of a certain size. And within that red circle, I've taken the total number of black pixels and divided by the total number of pixels. And I get a certain value for the density. And then I take a bigger circle, this large green circle that I can see, and I take the number of black pixels and divide by the total number of pixels there. And when I do that, and this is an actual calculation done on this checkerboard, done, of course, by me in BASIC, you can see that there are fluctuations because the round circles don't really catch the nature of the square grid very well. So every time I come to the edge of making the circle equal to an incremental integer ratio of the size of the boxes, I get a fluctuation like this. But you can see they average out, and so we have a nice limiting mean value. And so we can identify this mean value as the value of the density, and it's the value, the population value of the density of this checkerboard. So that's for a non-fractal. Now, let me give you an example of a fractal. This is an example of an object called a diffusion limited aggregation. And I won't explain how it's generated. Maybe I will explain how it's generated. What you do is you start with a particle you start with one particle here. And then you start with a particle far away, and it random walks until it finds that particle and it sticks. And then you release another one, and it random walks until it finds that and it sticks. And if you keep doing that one particle at a time, and the particles are released anywhere on an outer circle, and they diffuse in and then stick. And you get this structure which has these branches because when the structure is grown this way, if I release the next particle, it's more likely to hit one of the edges. In order for it to get deep in here, it's got to be really lucky because it's got to take a very well-defined trajectory if it's going to stick on the inside. So it's very unlikely to be added on the inside. It's more likely to be added to a growing tip. And as that happens, then we get self-similar voids because we have little voids and bigger voids and bigger voids. And actually, there are a number of structures that have this. One of the places that has this is lipids in the cell membrane. That is, in the cell membrane, there's more than one type of lipids. And each type of lipid, or one type of lipid, can actually diffuse through the cell and actually stick to a lipid of its own type. And so it's actually a similar process to this. And a group in Germany, for example, has attached fluorescent dyes onto one type of lipid and found that one type of lipid forms patterns very similar to this in the whole cell membrane. So there are biological objects that are like this. There's some evidence that soot particles from the result of combustion have properties like this. So for example, people at places like Ford study objects like this to understand how combustion in engines happens. And people make objects like this now because they have interesting properties. So there's a story from Richard Voss that it's possible to make a polymer that has objects like this. I think it's out of casein or something. And this is put in Dove ice cream. And the reason why this is put in is that it's harder for the ice cream to melt out of this. And this is one way to prevent the ice cream from melting faster. So there are objects like this. Now, if we look at the density of this object, again, if you look at the red circle over here, and we count the number of black pixels and divide by the number of pixels, and then look at the green circle over here. I should probably stop talking like this, otherwise I'll make up more and more things as I go along. So this is dangerous, but we'll stick to it for the moment. If we look at the larger green circle, the density will be lower because as we look at bigger and bigger scales, we include bigger and bigger voids. So this is a plot of the average density, actually the log of the average density against the log of the radius. And you can see the density keeps going down. Now this object is drawn on a finite size, but this object could really extend to infinity. So the issue here is not the border of the object, but that it has larger and larger voids at bigger and bigger sizes. And again, on a log-log plot, we have a straight line, and this is characteristic of the power laws of fractal scalings. And so we have no mean density here. And the second point about this object, which I think I made once before, is that if we look at some areas, like the area over here, for example, then the density is very high. And if we look at different areas, the density is very low. We're used to thinking in a measurement that if we follow the numbers for some time and the numbers change, that is, the average over an interval changes, we're used to thinking that the process that generated those numbers changed. And in this case, the process that generated both the voids and the material itself did not change. It's the same process. And so when the numbers in an experiment change, it does not necessarily mean that the underlying mechanism in the experiment changed. Now, how do we tell when the numbers change if something in the underlying mechanism has changed? And the answer is we don't know how to do that yet. And this is really an active area of investigation in fractals, and all the mathematics of fractals and how to apply them to real data is not understood yet. And we're hoping at some point that maybe that will be understood, or there will be better techniques for telling when the numbers change. This is a very surprising result. And again, what I'm trying to build up here is how the properties of fractals really affect the measurements that we have. So we would normally think if we do values measurements in time, and we got numbers like this, that we would normally think that during this period something in the experiment changed. And what I'm telling you is we can get a fractal distribution where we have changes like this, but where nothing changed. Now, this property is called non-stationarity. There's actually two types of non-stationarity. There's non-stationarity, and there's something called strict sense non-stationarity. And sometimes I know the difference between those two, although not at the moment. But it basically means that the moments measured at different points in time are different. So a moment like the mean measured here, if these are values in time, would be different from the moment measured at a different time. This is kind of like translational invariance in time, or is translational invariance in time. Now, the problem here, and this is the same problem we'll have when we come to the word chaos, is that this is a very poor choice of words. I used to say bad, but poor is probably more accurate. It's all this English stuff. Because non-stationarity kind of implies that things are changing. And that's not what it means. It means it's a very technical definition in terms of the moments. And we can have a fractal where we have changes like this, as you've just seen in this DLA, where we have changes in density at different points, but where nothing in the underlying mechanism has changed. Now, again, we don't know how to compare situations to know if there's a real change just by doing this. Now, of course, if I saw this in an experiment, I would immediately conclude probably that there was a change. But what I'm saying is that's not necessarily the case. And we don't have good tools at the moment to know when this happens. One of the things we can do is we can analyze a much larger data set than this. And if it's fractal, we're going to get variations like this are going to reoccur often. And they'll reoccur in a hierarchical way. And by measuring the change in variance as that occurs, if that change in variance, for example, variance is the amount of data analyzed, log variance of the log and the amount of data has a power law scaling, then we would think that these changes are fractal rather than representing a change in mechanism. So there are ways, as we'll come to, of analyzing data like this that at least would indicate that there's no underlying change in the mechanism, or that the underlying change in the mechanism has fractal properties. And this is another example. It's not actually what it says here. This is, if we look at the edge of a rock, we see this is a little hill in the rock, and there are self-similar bigger hills and self-similar bigger hills. That is, the little one kind of looks like the next larger one, which looks like the larger one. Now, I said this is not exactly this because I couldn't find, these people didn't actually publish a profile from the edge of the rocks. So actually these fluctuations are the variations in intensity from a quasi-stellar object, which is probably a very active galaxy. It's not a television set. And it has fluctuations that in time look like this. So I took that, actually I have real data from a QSO, quasi-stellar object, from a quasar, and put it here because it's the characteristics. But what they did publish in the article, and this is from people at the Lamont Geological Observatory at Columbia. And what they've plotted here is the root mean squared deviation in the height. And this is like the variance. And they've plotted this from scales of 10 microns up to 1,000,000 microns, which is better known as a meter. And you can see over this entire range, it's not that this variance approaches a finite limiting value, but this variance keeps increasing toward infinity. So before this, for example, people had measured the profile, this RMS value of the height, and had tried to use this to distinguish different geological features. That is, they were saying rougher rocks were a result of a different cause. But if people had measured over different lengths, they would get different answers. So this was not a good way to determine where the rock came from or what the origin of the rock was or the process that produced it. That you'll get different values for this if you measure at different scales. So this again shows an example where measuring at one scale isn't sufficient to really tell us what's going on. And this is another example that Maltai talked about when he was here about a month ago. What he's measuring are action potential. So they measure voltage versus time coming out of nerves in the ear, both from the vestibular system that deals with balance and from the auditory system that deals with hearing. And these represent action potentials. This is not a data record, but this is my drawing of this to symbolically represent what they have. What they do is they divide the record into time windows. So in this case, there were 2 spikes in this time interval, and 6 here, and 3 here, and 1, and 5, and 1. So now they can look at the firing rate. How many action potentials do they have in each window? So that rate would be 2, 6, 3, 1, 5. And they can make, in essence, a time series of these values. And they can repeat that for windows of bigger size. So here there are 8, 4, and 6. And now what they can do is look at the variation. This firing rate is a function of the sample number, that is, of the consecutive number of windows. Now, when they do this for the smallest window of a half a second, this, for me it's blue, it's sort of teal for you. This curve here represents the variation in that firing rate. Now, you would think as you go to a longer window, for example, a 5-second window, which is red to me and black to you, that the variations would be less. Because as we have a bigger window, we should be including more data. The average should be better defined and the variance less. That's what we said in the first half of this course. But in fact, if you look at the variation of this window, it's just as big as the variation of the original one. And if they go even to a longer window of 50 seconds, the variation is just as big. So this contradicts all the things we said in the first part of the class, that we have real data situations where as we average over more data, we do not reduce the variance in the data, but what we have is equally large fluctuations, and these are self-similar. That these fluctuations are related to the fluctuations at a different scale. Now, one of the other ways they can analyze this data is they can start off again in the same way, count the number of action potentials in each window, and they can now make a histogram of how often they find one action potential in a window, 2 action potentials, 3 and 4. And this is that distribution from the example I just gave. So in this case, there was no windows that had 0. There were 3 windows that had 1 action potential, 1 window which had 2, 1 window which had 3, and 1 window which had 4. And so we can see that again. There was a 2, 3, and a 4, and 3 1s. And they call this the pulse number distribution. And they can look at the properties of this distribution. And these are the properties. So this is looking at the properties of the pulse number distribution coming from a neuron in the vestibular system, these 3 semicircular canals that are involved in doing balance. Tempted to switch to the big camera and balance, but I'm not going to do that. But it would be a nice graphic. Okay. So we look at the pulse number distribution here, and this is their actual data. And you can see it runs between 0 pulses and 0 action potentials and 4 action potentials. for a window of 50 milliseconds. When we go to a window of 200 milliseconds, it runs longer because on average, in a window 4 times as long, right, we'll have on average, if the average means anything, 4 times as many action potentials. So it goes from 0 to 16. And relatively over this range, this is narrower than that. So this is the usual case of a Gaussian distribution. We accumulate more data, and the system looks narrower and more like a Gaussian. And this is called the central limit theorem. Now let's see what happens to this other neuron. This is the neurons in hearing, and this is from an auditory neuron. And here, first of all, you notice as they go to 4 times the length in the time window, that this axis does not change by a factor of 4, changes in a different way. And second, you can see here that it actually looks more Gaussian when we look at the smaller window, and it looks less Gaussian at the larger window. And in fact, as we go on to the larger window, this has gotten more broad. Remember here, this got more narrow, and now it's gotten more broad here. So we've accumulated more data, but the result is not that the distribution is more narrow, but it's broader. Moreover, you can see that there is more detail in the distribution. Not only does it look, let's write some of these things down. So in the vestibular neuron and in the auditory neuron, what we have here as we go to longer time windows, this distribution became more narrow, more like a smooth Gaussian. Okay. Whereas for the auditory neuron, what happened, it became broader, became less smooth, and it became less Gaussian. And so this is an example of a system that is well described by Gaussian statistics, and the auditory neuron is an example that's fractal. And one of the aspects that's important between these two cases is that in the first case, the central limit theorem applies. For this vestibular neuron, and that represents these properties, whereas for the fractal auditory unit, the central limit theorem does not apply. Say this in a different way, one of the crucial assumptions used in proving the central limit theorem is that the variance is finite, and in this case, the variance is infinite. As we've seen before in terms of the St. Petersburg game, in terms of the roughness of rocks. And so we're in the same situation here in terms of the variance of the timing of the action potentials producing the interspike intervals. So these are the different characteristics. Now, one of the things that people have been doing is to use these different characteristics to describe or characterize the function of different nerve cells. So some nerve cells have fractal characteristics, and some nerve cells are not fractal, and perhaps that's telling us something about how the nerve cells work. Now, in terms of the nerve cells as well as the function, meaning the timing of the action potentials or the interspike intervals, we can also have the shape of the nerve cells. So, for example, this is a nerve cell with dimension about 1.1 or 1.2, and this is a nerve cell with dimension about 1.6. And so we can use the dimension to characterize the shape of the nerve cells. And for example, one of the groups that I work with, although I'm not actively involved in this project, is correlating in the retina in amacrine cells. And this is a group in London and Liebovitch. And they're characterizing in these amacrine cells the fractal dimension of the shape related to the fractal dimension of the function. Okay. Now, to return to the auditory system, again, looking now at the measure of the variance. In this case, it's actually it's actually not this. It's actually the variance divided by the mean, despite what it says here. So this is really a normalized measure of the variance. This is also sometimes called the coefficient of variation. So there are different names for the same factors. So here it's called the Fano factor, which is the variance divided by the mean. So, and this is a function of the window length that we look at. And for small window lengths, which is of the order of the refractory period, the variance divided by the mean is 1. But then from much longer windows, we see that as we accumulate more data over bigger window sizes, the variance, in this case a normalized measure of the variance, increases with the window size. So this is exactly what we saw in terms of the St. Petersburg game, that the variance here is infinite, that the variance keeps going toward infinity. And that's why the central limit theorem doesn't apply, because the central limit theorem assumes that the variance is finite. So this is a second way of realizing that this data is fractal. So we understand that the timing of this data is fractal because, 1, we see the variance increase with the window size. 2, we see the situation becoming less, the probability density function becoming less Gaussian as we accumulate more data. So this is, I think, worth saying. These are the characteristics that indicate that we have something that's fractal and cannot be handled by Gaussian statistics. So it means that the mean and the variance, although we can measure them from any sample, will not give us information on the real mean and variance from the population. And the characteristics are, 1, that as we accumulate more data, the thing looks less Gaussian. That is, not smoother and not Gaussian. So that's not as good as the first Gaussian. Shouldn't have tried for 2. And as we accumulate more data, the variance keeps increasing toward infinity. And these are the hallmarks of a fractal distribution. And again, the practical consequences of this is that just computing the mean and variance from one sample of data is not going to be the right way to characterize this data. And this gives another example. This is blood flow in the heart. And what we see here is the way the blood flow is measured is they use a tracer substance which accumulates in the arteries and veins in the heart. And this tracer substance is radioactive. And so they're able to measure the amount of blood flow in a particular volume of tissue by measuring the radioactivity of that amount of tissue. Then what they do is they take a heart, they run this stuff through it. They then, in this case, literally cut the heart into different sized pieces and measure the radioactivity in those pieces. And that's what they do. And, but they do it far away. It's like in Seattle, so it shouldn't be too frightening. They can actually measure They use both in the old days, or today too. This is done with spheres which are the size of a micron, but they actually pioneered a technique where they use a large molecule that also gets caught in the tissue. And so they can measure much finer capillaries and blood flow. And here, as they cut the heart into finer and finer pieces, the variance, in this case, which they call the relative deviation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean, as they cut the heart into finer pieces, they see more and more variations in the blood flow. So the relative deviation, whatever the D stands for, is proportional to the mass of the tissue times 1 minus the fractal dimension. And in this case, the fractal dimension was 1.2. And so you can see, again, we have a log-log plot, and we have a straight line indicating a power law scaling. So let's see what example will appear next on the screen. I have a feeling it's going to be a lung. No, this is still part of the first example. They have a model for how this happens. So in the heart, if we have a blood vessel, it's going to divide into 2 blood vessels. And if they divided equally, this factor A would be a half, and half the flow would go to one vessel and half to the other. But they don't always divide exactly equally. So if this factor, if this A was, that was, of course, did you see that? Did you read it?
Who Carmen's dad is.
Right, no, that's what I was about to say. If A is not exactly a half, then there'll be a different amount of blood flow in these 2 arteries. And if this process continues, this branching at the end will produce increasingly large variance in the smaller vessels and in smaller sizes of tissues, and that's what they saw. And now we're up to the lungs. So here we use a slightly different analysis called the Hurst rescaled range analysis. This is complicated, so I'm not going to describe it, but we basically use a measure of dispersion, which is called the range. And the range is not the difference between the largest and smallest value. It's a little more complicated than that. The range is the deviation of the running sum from the mean over a given time window. So what we do is we have a series of values. We keep adding them together, taking, maybe I'll actually write down what it is. So this is an analysis by Hurst. Hurst was an engineer almost a century ago who worked for the British in Egypt, and he was computing how the flow of the river Nile, and they had built a reservoir. Water, of course, has to be blue. They've built a reservoir to hold the water from the Nile behind a dam. I guess dams are red. So they have a dam, and that's holding back the water. Well, that's why it's red. So, so this was actually called the Aswan Dam, and later a new dam was to be built called the Aswan High Dam, which was built after Hurst died, and is one of the largest dams in the world. And also involved moving some archaeological treasures. No, what's the name of the temple? It's a temple with 4 columns in front. In any event, that temple was at the bottom of a hill, and it was actually moved. What? Hatshepsut? Yeah. No. Is it? I don't think so. I don't remember. In any event, that was cut out of the rock and moved further up the mountain, actually, because that area was flooded later on. So the deal here is how often does it rain? That is, what is the rainfall in each year? And what Hurst discovered was that this rainfall, if we plot the amount of rain per year, had fluctuations which are basically fractal fluctuations. And this is important because if we go through a period, there are longer and long periods of large rainfall, and that would mean that the reservoir would have to be larger and larger for the Aswan High Dam. And that's what he was trying to compute. And he invented this analysis that is, in essence, a measure of dispersion versus the amount of data analyzed, which in his case was time. And then the measure of dispersion that he invented was, I'll do this in terms of numbers because it's easier to see. What we do is we create the running sum. So this is 31. The next number will be 31 plus 32. The next number will be the sum of all of these. And then in each case, we subtract out the mean number, which in this case will be 32. And then that will produce a number, which in this case here is -1. In this case will be 31, and in this case will be 64. And then we look at the variations of these numbers, and we take the range, the maximum minus the minimum of these numbers. So this is what he called R. So it's not just the difference between the maximum and minimum, it's the running sum minus the mean, the difference between that maximum and minimum. And then what he did is he normalized that by the standard deviation over a time period. And this is called sometimes also R over S, or Hurst analysis. And then what he plotted was the log of R over S versus the log of what he called the lag, which is what I've been calling the window size. So it's the duration in time. And as you can see from the plot of the rainfall here, I won't draw it again, that if we look over a small time, we're only likely to see a small deviation in the rainfall, but over a longer time, we're likely to see a much larger deviation in the rainfall. And so what Hurst found was that if he did this, he got a curve that looked like this. And on a log plot, the slope of this curve, this exponent was, probably not by him, but by Mandelbrot, called h, was a value of about 0.8 for the rainfall. Now, if we had a situation with a purely random walk, so that the increments, the difference between the values was purely random, meaning that there was no memory, each step was separate, then we would get on a curve of this log R over S versus log lag, a slope of h equals a half. So a slope of h greater than a half tells us there's memory in the system, so that when it starts going up, it keeps going up for a longer time than if it was random, and that produces these bigger fluctuations. I'll say that more clearly here. So I'm going to start in the middle of the page here. If this is some value x versus time, we can have random increments which will look something like this. So this means the difference between the two numbers has no memory. But if we have memory in the system, and this corresponds to h of a half. If we have memory in the system, then when we keep going up, we'll go up. So the curve looks smoother than when, so this is an example where we have memory that's positive. If the curve is going up here, it's going up, and this is fractal. So let me redraw this. This is the random one. It's still having fractal deviations, but it's going to look smoother than the one with no memory. So with no memory, what I'll call positive memory, let's say this is now an h of 0.8, this is an h of 0.5. Now, the memory is at all time scales. So you see there's memory at this time scale. If it's going up here, it's going up here. But there's also memory at the time scale that extends from here to there. And also memory that extends over this time scale. So the memory is over all time scales. Now we can also have the opposite situation where if it goes up at one time, it's more likely to come down. And if we do that, you can see that it's going to be rougher than this, because if we go up then we're going to move in the opposite direction. So I can call this an example of negative memory. Again, at all time scales, and this might be an h of 0.2. Now, this h is related to the fractal dimension because the dimension is going to be 2 minus h. So the dimension of this trace in time is actually 1.5. You can see that if this moved up and down infinitely fast, that this would actually be a dimension of 2. So when h is 0, the dimension is 2. So this is a dimension that as h approaches 0, the dimension approaches 2. And for this one, as h approaches 1, then the dimension here approaches 1. Because when it has infinite memory, it's going to be a straight line. It's going to be smooth. So this Hurst exponent, we can see, is related to the dimensions of these traces. But we can determine this by this plot of measuring some measure of dispersion versus window size. And the slope on that plot can give us information to characterize this signal. For sake of completeness, let me also say that this type of memory is called by Mandelbrot persistence. And the negative memory is called anti-persistence. And signals that have this characteristic are also called, well, the h equals half was known as Brownian noise, as Brownian, after, I believe, the Scottish physicist or biologist Brown. Brown showed that if you looked in a microscope, you saw little pieces of, for example, pollen moving around. And people thought only living things moved around. But Brown showed that not only living things move around, but just from the molecules hitting these things, that the pollen grains, which are big compared to the molecules, would go off in random directions, so that non-living things could also move around. And the person who actually did the physics of how the little molecules hit and move these things around was Wright. So this is one of the many things that Einstein did. This was actually one of the first things that Einstein did. So this was long before he got into the bagels. Okay. So the fractal version of this is called, when h is not equal to a half, is called fractional Brownian motion. Let me rewrite on another page here. So it's called fractional Brownian motion, which is abbreviated just the way it's written here, FBM.
Why is it twice Brownian?
Oh, some.
Yeah.
So, and it's not called fractal Brownian motion. So it's not called this, it's called that. And the increments, so this fractal Brownian motion would be this whole thing. Just the increments from one thing to another is called fractional Gaussian noise. So fractional Gaussian noise would be the derivative of fractional Brownian motion. Okay, so get back here to where we were, this was the analysis that I did in connection with Barney Hoop, who, by the way, right now is actually in the physics department where Ian Kirk is in New Zealand. They haven't talked yet, but he knows what department he's in. We're hoping they're talking a little bit later. He's currently on a sabbatical from Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital down in New Zealand for 6 months. And this is data from Cassini. This is really old kind of data. These are rats in Boston that are breathing into a machine with a bellows, and the machine goes up, and as the bellows goes up, there's a little pen that moves on a round piece of paper that records the volume of their breath. It's called like a plasmometer or something like that, or plasmograph. What is plotted here is the log of the rescaled range, which is what this is called, divided by the log of the lag, and the slope here was about 0.76. So what that means is that there's memory in the breaths. When I draw in a breath now, it affects the breath that I take in the next minute, and in the next 30 minutes, and in the next hour. So there are long-term correlations in the breaths that are drawn in. And I guess it's not shown here, but one of the things that Barney has also been doing in collaboration with these other people is they have a preparation which consists of the brain measuring. So this is just the brain stem. So this is not anatomically accurate. Okay. And this sits actually in a pipette where they can measure the voltage. And one of the things they've been looking at is as they change the acetylcholine concentration, which affects this, they actually can see a change in the Hurst parameter change. So that the memory of the system depends on the acetylcholine levels. And they can watch that change as a function of acetylcholine concentration. So this is one way that the fractals have been able to analyze the data. This is a voltage averaged over the whole piece. And this is one of the things that I've been helping them to do, is to do this measurement. We're hoping this tells us something about how the fractals, how this fractal correlations are useful in characterizing the system. And why don't we take a break and come back at 10:30.